I came home from prison and my 9-year-old asked me, "Who are you?" I stood by the door with my release papers in hand, staring at the kid whose goofy smile I would never mix up. "Clayton, baby, it's me. It's Mommy. I'm home." Clayton went pale like he'd seen a ghost. "But Daddy said you died in prison." "What? That's crazy, I'm right here." He backed away into the house, his tears now streaming. No, Mommy's dead. We went to her funeral. I put flowers on the wooden box she was in." "What box? What funeral?" I stepped forward, but Clayton ran deeper into the house. "Daddy!" My husband Carter appeared in the hallway, and when he saw me, his knees literally buckled. "Who are you?" He pulled Clayton behind him, protective. "Carter, what are you talking about?" "It's me, Vivian. I just got released from prison. I held my release papers out, but he didn't move. Vivian died 8 months ago." His voice was breaking. "Sewer slide in her cell. The warden called me himself and delivered the goodbye letter. I identified the body. We buried her. My legs felt weak. That's impossible. I wrote you letters every week. I called when I could. We talked about Clayton's birthday 3 weeks ago." Carter shook his head slowly. "I haven't gotten a letter or call in 8 months. Not since..." He paused. "Since my wife died. I don't know who you are or what kind of sick game this is, but you need to leave." "Game? Carter, I'm your wife. We've been married for 12 years. He walked to the kitchen drawer and pulled out a folder. His hands were steady now, like he'd made up his mind about something. Inside were documents, a death certificate with my name, official prison letterhead saying I'd taken my own life, a program from my funeral with my picture on it. "This is my wife's death certificate," he said quietly, signed by the prison doctor. I stared at the papers. They looked real. Official seals, signatures, everything. "This is fake. It has to be. Someone's lying to you." Clayton peeked around his father. "You smell like Mommy," he whispered to me, "like her shampoo." But Carter remained firm. He pulled Clayton back gently. "Buddy, I know you miss Mommy, but this isn't her. Sometimes bad people pretend to be someone we love." The way he said it, so protective, so sad, made me feel crazy. That's when a woman appeared from the hallway. Blonde, maybe 30, with her hand resting on a visibly pregnant belly. She looked about 7 months along. "Carter? Is everything okay?" She walked over and touched his arm. "This woman says she's Vivian," Carter said quietly. The blonde woman's eyes immediately filled with shock and sympathy. "Oh, honey." She reached her hand out to me. "I'm so sorry. But after Carter lost his wife, we met in a support group. I lost my husband too. I know how horrible grief can be." She turned to Carter. "Should I call the police? You married someone else?" My voice cracked as I saw the ring on her finger. "It's been 8 months and you're already having a baby with someone else?" I grieved. I moved forward for Clayton. "Cassandra has been wonderful with him." Cassandra squeezed his hand. "Clayton, sweetie, why don't you go to your room while we handle this?" Clayton looked at me one more time. He was starting to believe me. "But she has Mommy's voice too." I gave him our signature smile that used to mean pancake time. "She did the smile." Cassandra kneeled down to him. "I know, sweetie." Clayton's eyes lit up. "Can I go hug her?" he asked hopefully. "No, honey. Your Mommy is in heaven, remember? We visited her special place last week." I tried to protest, but she sent Clayton upstairs and pulled out her phone. "I'm sorry, but I need to protect my family." She dialed 911 while my husband just stood there. "Yes, there's a woman at our house claiming to be my husband's deceased wife. She seems mentally ill." "Wait." I was desperate now. "Ask me anything. Anything about us that only I would know," I begged Carter. "Our first date was at that terrible Chinese place. You got food poisoning. Clayton was born during a snowstorm." Carter's expression shifted, but that's when Cassandra interrupted. "Anyone could find that out. Social media, talking to friends. Ma'am, I understand grief makes people do things, but this is cruel. The scar on my stomach from my C-section," I continued. "That looks like a sword." Carter's face went white. "How do you know that?" I lifted my shirt slightly, showing my sword-shaped C-section scar. Carter stumbled backward. "Oh my God. How is this possible?" Cassandra's hand tightened on his arm. "Carter, scars can be faked. Don't let her manipulate you." I could tell Carter was torn. The police arrived within minutes. The officer looked at my release papers, then at the death certificate that Carter showed him. "These release papers look legitimate," the officer said. "But so does this death certificate. Let me make some calls." He stepped aside, phone to his ear. After 5 minutes, he came back. "The prison confirms Vivian Jennings died 8 months ago. Sewer slide. Body was released to the family." He looked at me with pity. "Ma'am, I don't know who you are, but you need to leave. If you come back, you'll be arrested." As they led me away, I heard Clayton crying through the upstairs window. "But she knew about the scar. Mommy always said it's because I was her warrior." I could hear Cassandra's voice soothing him. "Sometimes people do research. Your daddy talks about your Mommy online sometimes. People can learn things." But the way she said it made my blood run cold. Something fishy was happening, and I was going to find out. I drove 2 blocks away and pulled into an empty parking lot behind a closed grocery store. My hands shook so hard I could barely turn off the engine. The release papers sat in my lap, crumpled from where the officer had grabbed them to check. I kept hearing his voice saying the prison confirmed I died 8 months ago. My phone had 3% battery left and nowhere to charge it. I reclined the seat back and stared at the car's ceiling, trying to make sense of what just happened. Carter's face when he saw me kept playing in my head like a movie I couldn't turn off. The way he looked at me like I was a stranger. The way Cassandra touched his arm, protective, like she owned him now. Clayton crying through the window about the scar. I must have dozed off because when I opened my eyes, gray light was coming through the windshield. My neck hurt from the awkward angle and my mouth tasted awful. I checked my phone, 2% battery, 6:47 a.m. The county records office opened at 8. I started the car and drove downtown, my release papers clutched in one hand. The clerk at the records office was a tired-looking woman with glasses hanging on a chain. I slid my papers across the counter. She glanced at them, then typed something into her computer. Her fingers stopped moving. She looked at the screen, then at me, then back at the screen. She picked up her phone without saying anything and pressed a button. A man in a tie came out from a back office, the supervisor based on his badge. He looked at my papers, typed on the same computer, and his eyebrows went up. "Ma'am, our system shows you deceased as of 8 months ago," he said quietly. "Death certificate filed by the Department of Corrections." My stomach dropped. "That's impossible. I just got out yesterday. I'm right here." He clicked his mouse a few times. "The record shows Vivian Jennings died by suicide in custody. There's a death certificate on file." He paused. "Would you like a copy?" I nodded because I couldn't speak. He disappeared into the back and returned with a printed document. My name, my birth date, date of death 8 months ago, the prison doctor's signature, an official state seal that looked completely real. I walked out to my car on shaky legs and sat in the driver's seat comparing the two documents. The release papers had official letterhead, signatures, stamps. The death certificate had official letterhead, signatures, stamps. Both looked legitimate. Both had state seals. Someone went to huge trouble to make the world think I died while keeping me alive in prison. Someone with access to official systems and documents. Someone who could fake a death certificate and make it appear in government databases. I needed to figure out who and why, but I had no idea where to start. I remembered the prison counselor mentioning something about a re-entry resource center downtown that helped people coming out. I had almost no money, maybe $40 in my release funds, and nowhere to stay. I typed the address into my phone before the battery died completely and drove there. The re-entry center was in an old brick building with a faded sign. Inside, a woman at the front desk looked up when I walked in. I started explaining my situation and watched her expression change from polite interest to shock to alarm. She picked up her phone mid-sentence and called someone. "I need to connect you with legal aid right now," she said. "This is way beyond normal re-entry stuff. You need a lawyer who understands criminal justice and civil identity problems." While she made calls, she pointed me toward a computer in the corner. I logged into my old email account using the password I remembered. The account opened, but everything looked wrong. I checked the login history. 8 months ago, my account was accessed from an IP address I didn't recognize. The same day, my password was changed. I got locked out right when the death documentation appeared. Someone had taken over my email account to stop me from contacting anyone. I went back to the front desk and asked to use the phone. The woman handed it over, and I dialed the prison's records department from memory. A bored-sounding clerk answered. I asked about my outgoing mail logs and phone records. She put me on hold. 15 minutes of bad elevator music later, she came back. "Those records require a formal written request. Processing takes 4 to 6 weeks." I hung up feeling defeated. Everything required waiting, required paperwork, required time I didn't have. The re-entry worker got off her phone and smiled at me. "Legal aid is calling you back. They're scheduling an intake appointment." Her phone rang 5 minutes later. She handed it to me and I talked to someone who scheduled me with an attorney named Halima Ward. 3 days from now. 3 days felt like forever when I had nowhere to sleep and my son thought I was dead. The re-entry worker must have seen my face because she made another call and found me an emergency shelter bed for tonight. I thanked her and left with the address written on a scrap of paper. Back in my car, I couldn't stop thinking about Clayton's face when he saw me. The way his eyes lit up for just a second before the fear took over. He recognized me. He knew my smell, my voice, my smile. Before Cassandra convinced him otherwise, he knew I was his mom. I found a notebook in my glove compartment and started writing. Every detail I could remember about our life together. The way I used to make pancakes shaped like dinosaurs. The song I sang when he couldn't sleep. The game we played where we pretended his toy cars could talk. The time he broke his arm falling off the swing and I held him in the emergency room. His favorite stuffed elephant named Mr. Trunk. The scar on his knee from learning to ride his bike. Things only his real mother would know. Things I might need to prove who I am. I drove to the shelter address the re-entry worker gave me. The building looked old and tired, with peeling paint and a flickering light over the entrance. Inside, a woman at the front desk checked my name against a list and handed me a key to a locker and a thin blanket. The sleeping area had rows of cots packed close together, and I found an empty one near the back wall. I stashed my car keys and the notebook in the locker, then sat on the cot with my release paperwork spread out on my lap. My property inventory sheet listed everything I supposedly had in my cell when I got released. My toothbrush, 3 books, a photo of Clayton from 5 years ago, 2 pairs of socks, underwear, the prison-issued clothes I wore out. But I remembered writing at least 6 letters to Carter in the weeks before my supposed death 8 months ago. Letters about Clayton's upcoming birthday, about how I was counting down the days until release, about how much I missed them both. None of those letters showed up on the outgoing mail log attached to my property sheet. The log stopped 8 months ago with a letter to my sister. Then nothing. Like my ability to communicate with the outside world just vanished overnight. I woke up early when someone's alarm went off 3 cots over. My back hurt from the thin mattress and I felt gritty from sleeping in my clothes. I grabbed my stuff from the locker and headed out before the breakfast rush started. The death certificate Carter showed me listed the cemetery name and plot number. I punched the address into my phone and drove across town. The cemetery gates were open and I followed the winding road past rows of headstones until I found the section number. I parked and walked through wet grass, reading names and dates on markers until I saw it. My name, Vivian Jennings. My birth date, and a death date from 8 months ago. Fresh flowers sat in a metal vase attached to the headstone. Someone had been here recently, probably Carter and Clayton visiting what they thought was my grave. I stood there staring at my own headstone and felt like I was watching myself from outside my body. This thing existed in the real world. Someone paid money for it. Someone carved my name into stone. Someone put my supposed body in the ground under this exact spot. The whole thing felt wrong in a way that made my skin crawl. I pulled out my phone and took photos of everything. The headstone from different angles, the flowers, the plot number marker, the funeral home name engraved at the bottom of the stone. Then I walked back to my car and looked up the funeral home address. 3 blocks away. I drove over and parked in their small lot. The building was brick with white columns, trying to look fancy but mostly looking dated. Inside smelled like flowers and carpet cleaner. A man in a dark suit looked up from a desk when I walked in. I asked if I could speak to whoever handled arrangements for Vivian Jennings 8 months ago. He looked confused and asked if I was a family member. I told him I was Vivian Jennings and I needed to see the file. His face went pale and he stood up quickly, saying he needed to get the director. A few minutes later, an older man came out and introduced himself as Mick Elliott. He asked what this was about, and I could tell he thought I was some kind of scam artist or crazy person. I pulled out my release papers and held up my wrist so he could see the prison ID bracelet they forgot to cut off when I left. His expression changed from defensive to shocked. He asked me to wait and disappeared into a back office. When he came back, he was carrying a thick folder. He sat down at a table in a small conference room and opened it carefully. The death certificate was on top, signed by someone named Dr. Jas Finley from the prison medical unit. Under that was a transport authorization form with official Department of Corrections letterhead, instructing the funeral home to receive the deceased and prepare for immediate burial. Mick's hands shook slightly as he flipped through the pages. Mick started explaining what happened 8 months ago in a quiet voice. The body arrived in a sealed transport bag with a tag attached that had my name and prisoner number. The paperwork said closed casket only, no viewing, because of the nature of the death. He said this was unusual but not unheard of with prison deaths, especially when they involved violence or trauma. Carter came in to make arrangements and sign papers, but he never actually saw the body. The prison insisted the remains stay sealed for health and safety reasons. Mick admitted this bothered him at the time because he usually requires family identification, but the documentation was so official and complete that he went along with the prison's protocol. Carter picked out a casket, approved the headstone design, and paid for everything. The burial happened 3 days later with Carter, Clayton, and a few of Carter's friends attending. Mick showed me photos from the service. My son standing next to that closed casket holding Carter's hand. I asked Mick if I could get copies of everything in the file. He hesitated, looking at the papers and then at my face, and then at my prison ID bracelet. Finally, he said he would make copies because something about this whole situation felt wrong to him even back then. He took the folder to a copy machine in the corner, and I heard it humming and clicking for several minutes. He came back with a stack of papers and slid them across the table. The transport authorization, the death certificate, his intake notes describing how the sealed body arrived, the invoice Carter paid, everything. I thanked him and left before he could change his mind about helping me. Back at the shelter, I found an empty table in the common room and spread out all my documents. Release papers on the left, death certificate and funeral home papers on the right, my property inventory sheet and the stopped mail log in the middle. I grabbed a pen and started writing a timeline on the back of an envelope. 8 months ago, something happened that made my letters stop going out. Same time, someone accessed my email account from an unknown location and changed my password. Same week, a death certificate got created with a prison doctor's signature. Days later, a sealed body got transported to the funeral home under my name. Carter received official notification. A funeral happened. My family buried someone they thought was me. All of this happened while I was alive in my cell, completely unaware that the outside world thought I was dead. A social worker doing rounds through the shelter stopped at my table and asked if I needed help with anything. I explained I just got released and needed to apply for food stamps and emergency cash assistance. She pulled out some forms and helped me fill them out. When we submitted them online, both applications immediately got flagged with error messages. The state database showed me as deceased. The social worker tried calling the benefits office but got transferred 3 times before giving up. She said I would need to get my legal status resolved before any assistance programs would work. Same thing happened when I tried to get a library card to use their computers. The librarian typed my name and social security number into the system, frowned at her screen and said she couldn't issue a card to someone listed as deceased in the state records. Every system I touched treated me like a ghost. I spent my second night at the shelter writing a long letter to Carter on notebook paper. I explained everything I found out so far. The missing letters on my property inventory, the grave with my name on it, The funeral home file showing a sealed body that no one actually identified. The stopped email account and the timeline of when everything happened. I made copies of my release papers and printed the photos of the grave from my phone at a drugstore. I put it all in an envelope with Carter's name on it. I wanted him to see the evidence in writing, when Cassandra wasn't there to intercept or explain it away. Maybe seeing it all laid out would help him understand that something terrible happened to both of us. The next morning I looked up Carter's workplace address online. He worked at an insurance company downtown in a big office building. I drove there and went to the mailroom in the lobby, addressing the envelope to Carter's full name and company. The clerk took it without asking questions, and I walked out feeling like I accomplished something small but important. Then I drove to the DMV to try getting a new ID since mine expired while I was in prison. I waited in line for 40 minutes before getting to a window. The clerk typed my information into her computer and her face changed. She called over a supervisor. The supervisor looked at the screen and then at me and said they couldn't issue identification to someone whose records showed them as deceased. I tried explaining about the prison error, but the supervisor just kept saying I needed to resolve my status with the State Vital Records Office first. I left the DMV with nothing, still unable to prove who I was to any official system. The legal aid office was in a rundown building near the courthouse, 3rd floor with no elevator. I climbed the stairs carrying my folder of documents, my legs still shaky from the DMV rejection. The waiting room had plastic chairs and outdated magazines, but the receptionist was kind when I explained I had an appointment with Halima Ward. She led me to a small office where a woman in her 40s sat behind a desk covered in case files. Halima stood up and shook my hand firmly, her grip warm and reassuring in a way that made my throat tight. She gestured to the chair across from her desk and pulled out a yellow legal pad, pen ready. I started talking and couldn't stop, the whole story pouring out while she wrote page after page of notes. She asked specific questions about dates and times, about who I talked to at the prison, about the exact wording on the death certificate. When I got to the part about Clayton recognizing my smell and smile, she looked up from her notes with something sad in her eyes but kept writing. An hour passed, then another, and she never once acted like I was crazy or lying. She'd handled cases where people were wrongly convicted, she told me, but never anything like this where someone got erased from official records while still breathing. The legal pad was half full by the time I finished, and she flipped back through her notes before speaking. We needed to file an emergency petition with the court, she explained, to legally prove my identity and get a protective order so I couldn't be arrested just for existing. Her voice was steady and professional as she laid out the timeline, warning me this could take months and would need solid proof. DNA evidence comparing me to Clayton would be essential, along with testimony from people who knew me before prison. I nodded, trying to absorb everything while she pulled up forms on her computer. The keyboard clicked as she typed, asking me questions about my background and family history. Did I have any living relatives who could provide DNA samples or testimony? My sister lived 3 states away, I told her, but we hadn't spoken since before prison because our relationship was complicated. Halima wrote that down and said complicated relationships were still useful for DNA comparison. She opened a new window on her screen and started listing all the evidence I'd gathered. The release papers with their official stamps and signatures. The funeral home file showing the sealed body transport. The timeline of when my email got locked. My stopped letters that never reached Carter. She typed quickly, organizing everything into categories. But we needed more, she said without looking up from the screen. My complete prison records, including surveillance footage from the day I supposedly died. Medical files showing I was alive and getting treatment. Visitor logs proving I had contact with staff. Phone records showing calls I made. She would file a Freedom of Information Act request for all of it, she told me, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she drafted the document. The request went to the Department of Corrections demanding every piece of paper and video related to my case. While that printed, she opened another document and started writing a letter to the prison warden. Her tone shifted to formal and stern as she typed about preservation of evidence and potential criminal violations. She copied the State Attorney General's office on the letter, she explained, because this situation went beyond normal administrative errors. Someone with access to official systems had deliberately falsified records, and that was a serious crime. The printer hummed as page after page came out, and she signed each one with a flourish before sliding them into envelopes. I watched her work with a strange mix of relief and anxiety building in my chest. Someone was finally taking action instead of just telling me I was wrong or confused. She sealed the envelopes and stacked them in her outbox for mailing, then turned back to me with a small smile. This was just the beginning, she warned. But at least now I had representation and a plan. I left her office an hour later with copies of everything she filed, walking down those 3 flights of stairs with my folder thicker than before. For the first time since showing up at Carter's door, I felt like maybe I could prove what happened to me. The panic and confusion that had been choking me for days loosened just a little bit. I had a lawyer who believed me and knew how to fight bureaucratic systems. Outside on the sidewalk, I checked the time on the shelter's loaner phone they'd given me for emergencies. Still afternoon, with hours before I needed to be back for dinner. I started walking toward the bus stop when a woman approached me, maybe 35 with a messenger bag and a professional but friendly smile. She introduced herself as Kirsten Logan and said she was a journalist who covered criminal justice issues. Someone at the reentry center had mentioned my situation, she explained, and she wanted to hear my story. My stomach clenched with worry about making things worse, about Cassandra seeing my name in the news and using it to keep me from Clayton. But Kirsten kept talking, explaining how media attention often forced bureaucratic systems to move faster because nobody wanted to look incompetent in public. She promised to verify every detail before publishing anything, and to protect my privacy as much as possible while still exposing what the prison system did. I studied her face, trying to decide if I could trust her. She pulled out a business card with her name and the newspaper's logo, along with links to articles she'd written about wrongful convictions and prison reform. The articles looked legitimate when I glanced at them on her phone, serious investigations that had led to policy changes. I agreed to talk, and we found a coffee shop 2 blocks away where she bought me lunch while I told her everything again. She recorded our conversation on her phone after asking permission, and took notes in a spiral notebook covered in coffee stains. 2 hours passed while I laid out the timeline, showed her my documents, explained about the funeral home and the sealed body. Her eyes widened when I showed her mixed file about the transport protocol, and she took photos of every page with her phone's camera. This was highly unusual, she said. Almost unheard of for a body to arrive sealed with no viewing. It suggested someone with institutional authority had orchestrated the whole cover-up. Someone who could manipulate official paperwork and transport procedures. She photographed my release papers, the death certificate copy, the grave photos, everything. When we finished, she packed up her notes and promised to start making calls to the Department of Corrections. She would request official comment on my case and see how they responded, she told me. Their reaction would tell her a lot about whether this was a simple mistake or something more deliberate. I rode the bus back to the shelter feeling exposed and nervous about what would happen when her article came out. The next afternoon, Kirsten texted me that she'd heard back from the DOC Public Information Office. Their response was brief and bureaucratic, she said, claiming they were looking into the matter but couldn't discuss individual inmate records. That was government speak for internal panic, she explained, because organizations only used that kind of language when they were scrambling to figure out what went wrong. 3 days after I mailed my letter to Carter's workplace, an unknown number called the shelter's loaner phone. I almost didn't answer because I figured it was spam, but something made me pick up. Carter's voice came through shaking and uncertain, asking if we could meet somewhere public to talk. He'd gotten my letter at work, he said, and hadn't been able to think about anything else since reading it. My hands trembled as I agreed to meet him at the same coffee shop where I'd talked to Kirsten. He'd seen all the evidence laid out in writing, away from Cassandra's protective interference, and something had shifted in how he was processing everything. I hung up and sat on my shelter bunk staring at the phone, wondering if this meant he was starting to believe me, or if he just wanted more answers before deciding I was crazy. The coffee shop was nearly empty when I arrived the next afternoon, just a few people with laptops scattered around. Carter was already sitting at a corner table, and I could see from across the room that he looked terrible. Dark circles under his eyes, wrinkled shirt, hair sticking up like he'd been running his hands through it all night. The manila folder sat on the table in front of him, thick with papers. I slid into the chair across from him and watched as he opened the folder with shaking hands. He spread the documents across the table between us like he was laying out evidence at a crime scene. Death certificate, funeral program, official prison letters, all of it arranged in neat rows. His voice came out rough when he finally spoke, asking me how any of this could be real if I was sitting right here in front of him. I pulled out my own papers, the release documents with their official stamps and signatures. I walked him through everything I knew, pointing to dates on my paperwork, showing him the timeline of when my letters and calls should have reached him. He stared at the papers for a long time before admitting something that made my chest tight. He said it had seemed strange when my letters and calls suddenly stopped coming, but the prison counselor told him I was withdrawing emotionally before the suicide. That's what they told him, that I was pulling away from everyone, getting ready to do it. The counselor made it sound normal, like a pattern they'd seen before. Carter's hands were still shaking as he reached for his phone. He scrolled through his messages and turned the screen toward me. There was a text supposedly from me, dated exactly 8 months ago. The message said I couldn't handle prison anymore, that he should move on with his life and forget about me. I stared at those words and felt sick because I never wrote that. I never sent any text like that. I told him I didn't even know how someone could have accessed my phone account to text him, but clearly someone did. Someone wanted him to think I was giving up. He believed it too, believed I was saying goodbye. I asked him about the letter, the goodbye letter the warden supposedly delivered to him personally. Carter's face went pale and he reached for his wallet. He'd been carrying it with him for 8 months, he said, keeping it folded in the leather. The paper was worn soft from being handled, creased where it had been folded and unfolded probably hundreds of times. I took it from him carefully and started reading. The handwriting did look like mine, similar enough that I could see why Carter believed it. But the words were all wrong. The phrasing was stiff and formal, nothing like how I actually write or talk. It said things about accepting my fate and finding peace, phrases I would never use. It talked about Clayton in this distant way that made me want to scream because I never wrote like that about my son. Carter was watching my face as I read, really studying me. I could see something shifting in his eyes, like he was finally letting himself consider that maybe I was telling the truth. He asked me what I needed from him, his voice barely above a whisper. I told him straight out because there was no point dancing around it. I needed DNA testing to prove I was Clayton's biological mother. I needed him to stop treating me like some dangerous stranger who was trying to hurt his family. I needed him to help me figure out what happened and who did this to us. He nodded slowly and said he would agree to the DNA test, but then he added that he needed time to process everything before involving Clayton any further. Cassandra was terrified, he explained. scared that I was going to destroy the family she'd built with him. She was pregnant and worried about what my return meant for her baby, for Clayton, for everything they'd created together. He needed to figure out how to handle this situation without traumatizing everyone involved. I wanted to argue, wanted to demand immediate access to my son, but I forced myself to stay calm. We exchanged phone numbers, typing them into each other's phones right there at the table. Carter promised he would cooperate with Halima's legal proceedings, that he wouldn't fight me on the identity restoration. As we stood up to leave, he reached out and touched my arm briefly. The contact was so quick I almost missed it. He said he was sorry for not believing me at first, that the death certificate and the funeral had felt so real. Accepting that I was gone had seemed easier than questioning official documentation from the prison system. I rode the bus back to the shelter in a daze, my emotions all tangled up, exhausted but also weirdly hopeful for the first time since this nightmare started. Having Carter as an ally instead of an enemy changed everything, even though the path forward was still messy and complicated. At least now I had someone who believed me, someone who could help prove I was who I said I was. 2 days later, my phone buzzed with a call from Halima. She had news that made my pulse speed up. The Department of Corrections had assigned an internal investigator to review my case after her formal requests in Kirsten's article. A woman named Antonella Colombo from the Office of Inspector General wanted to interview me about what happened. Halima gave me the address of a government office building downtown and told me to bring every piece of documentation I had. The building was gray concrete and glass, the kind of place that screamed bureaucracy. Antonella met me in a small conference room on the 3rd floor. She was maybe 40, with dark hair pulled back tight and sharp eyes that missed nothing. All business from the second I walked in. She had a recording device on the table and clicked it on before we even sat down. Her questions were detailed and specific, drilling down into my last months in prison. She wanted to know about my daily routine, which officers worked my housing unit, who handled my mail. She asked about the grievance I'd filed 8 months ago, the one about missing outgoing letters. Every time I answered, she took notes in tight, precise handwriting. She made copies of all my documents using a scanner in the corner. My release papers, the death certificate copy, the funeral home file, the photos of the grave, everything. She was particularly interested in which correctional officers had access to my housing unit and the mailroom. She asked me to write down every name I could remember, every face I'd seen regularly during those final months before I was supposedly dead. The interview lasted almost 2 hours, and by the end I felt wrung out. But Antonella seemed satisfied with what I'd given her. She packed up her notes and recording device, then told me she'd be in touch as the investigation progressed. She couldn't share details about what they were finding, but she promised to keep Halima updated on anything relevant to my legal case. Antonella closed her folder and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. She pulled up something on her computer screen and turned the monitor so I could see it. The database showed my name with a death entry dated 8 months ago, but when she clicked on the details, something looked off. She pointed to a field that said verified by, and there was only one name listed instead of the usual multiple entries. Raina Harrington, mailroom supervisor. Antonella scrolled down and showed me the resignation date, exactly 2 weeks after my supposed death was recorded. The timing made my stomach drop. I stared at the name Raina Harrington, trying to figure out why it felt familiar. Then it hit me like a punch to the gut. Raina was the woman who worked in the mailroom, the one who always wore too much perfume and had long fake nails that clicked on the counter when she sorted packages. I remembered her because she was dating one of the corrections officers on my housing unit, a guy named Rodrigo, who had a thick mustache and always seemed annoyed when inmates asked him questions. I never had any major problems with either of them, just the usual prison staff attitude where they treated you like you were invisible or stupid. But 8 months ago, I did file a grievance. I had written 3 letters to Carter in 1 week because Clayton's birthday was coming up, and I wanted to make sure at least one got through. None of them ever made it to him. When I asked Raina about it, she got defensive and told me the mail system was backed up and sometimes letters got lost. I filed the grievance through the official process, documenting the dates I'd given her the letters and the fact that Carter never received them. The grievance went to her supervisor, and I never heard anything back about it. 2 weeks later, my outgoing mail privileges got suspended for some bogus rule violation I didn't even commit. Antonella was watching my face as I remembered all this. She handed me a yellow legal pad and a pen, and asked me to write down everything I could recall about that grievance. Every detail about the missing letters, every interaction with Raina, anything I remembered about Rodrigo or other staff members who might have been involved. She said she couldn't tell me specifics about the investigation because it was ongoing, but she confirmed they were looking into whether staff members falsified records to cover up mail theft or other types of misconduct. I started writing and the words just poured out. I wrote about how Raina always seemed rushed when I brought her outgoing mail, how she would toss the envelopes into a bin without really looking at them. I wrote about the grievance form I'd filled out, and how the response I got back was just a form letter saying my complaint had been reviewed and found to have no merit. I wrote about Rodrigo, and how he started giving me weird looks after I filed the grievance, like he knew something I didn't. I wrote about how my mail privileges got suspended right after that, and how I had to go through this whole appeal process just to be able to write to my family again. By the time I got my privileges back, Carter had stopped responding to my letters anyway. I thought he was mad at me or had given up on our marriage. I never imagined someone was literally making me disappear from the system. The pen shook in my hand as I kept writing. Antonella let me take my time, not rushing me, just occasionally nodding when I looked up. When I finally finished, I had filled 4 pages front and back with everything I could remember. She took the pages and read through them carefully, making notes on a separate pad. Then she looked at me with a serious expression and told me something that made my blood run cold. She said if Reina and Rodrigo were involved in this, I needed to stay far away from them. She said confronting them directly could mess up the investigation and potentially put me in danger. She said people who would go this far to cover up their crimes might do worse if they felt threatened. I promised her I wouldn't try to contact them, but inside I was screaming. These people had stolen my life, erased my identity, made my husband think I was dead, all to hide the fact that they were stealing mail. The thought made me want to throw up right there in her office. Antonella walked me out and told me she'd be in touch as the investigation moved forward. She reminded me one more time not to do anything stupid like trying to find Reina or Rodrigo on my own. I nodded and left the building feeling like I might collapse. Back at the shelter, I couldn't focus on anything. I kept thinking about Reina's clicking nails and Rodrigo's mustache and how these 2 random people had destroyed everything. That evening, my phone buzzed with a text from Kirsten. Her article had just gone live. I clicked the link and there it was, the headline reading, "Woman declared dead by prison system fights to reclaim her life." She had written it carefully, focusing on the documents and the systemic failures rather than making it sound like some crazy drama. She included quotes from my interview, photos of my release papers next to the death certificate, and questions about how the prison system could lose track of a living person. The article was good, really good, and I felt grateful that someone was telling my story the right way. Within an hour, the article started getting shared on social media. I watched the comments pile up on my phone screen. Most people were outraged, saying things like, "How does this even happen?" And "the system is so broken," and "this poor woman." Some people were skeptical, though, saying I was probably a con artist or mentally ill, that there had to be some reasonable explanation. But the supportive comments outnumbered the negative ones by a lot. People were sharing the article and tagging news organizations and government officials. It felt like maybe something good could come from all this attention. The next morning, the shelter director called me into her office. She looked stressed and uncomfortable. She told me she'd received a phone call the night before from someone claiming I was dangerous and shouldn't be around vulnerable people. The caller had said I was violent and unstable and that having me at the shelter put everyone at risk. The director said she didn't believe any of it, that I'd been nothing but quiet and respectful since I arrived. But she had to take the threat seriously because of liability issues and the safety of the other residents. She was really sorry, but she needed me to find somewhere else to stay. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. I gathered my few belongings and called Halima from outside the shelter. She sounded angry when I told her what happened. Angry at whoever made that call, not at me. She said she had some emergency legal aid funds she could use to get me into a cheap motel for a few weeks while we worked on more permanent housing. 2 hours later, I was checking into a rundown motel on the edge of town. The room smelled like cigarettes and cleaning chemicals. The bedspread had stains I didn't want to think about, and the TV only got 3 channels. But it had a door that locked and no one could tell me to leave. After weeks of the shelter's chaos and years of prison's constant noise and surveillance, having a private space felt like the biggest luxury in the world. I sat on the bed and just breathed for a few minutes, letting the silence sink in. My phone buzzed with a text from Carter. He said Cassandra had seen Kirsten's article and was really upset. She was worried that all the media attention would bring chaos into Clayton's life, that reporters might show up at the house or at his school. He asked if I could avoid doing any more publicity until the legal stuff got sorted out. I texted back that I understood and would hold off on any follow-up interviews. I didn't tell him that Kirsten had already asked me about doing more coverage. I didn't want to make things worse between him and Cassandra. 2 days later, Halima called with news. The court had scheduled a hearing on her emergency petition for 2 weeks from now. She said we needed to spend that time gathering as much evidence as possible. We needed the DNA results comparing me to Clayton. We needed my complete prison records showing I was alive when I was supposedly dead. We needed testimony from people who knew me before I went to prison. She rattled off a whole list of things we had to pull together, and I wrote them all down on the motel notepad. 2 weeks suddenly felt like no time at all to prove I existed. The first thing on Halima's list was contacting my sister. I hadn't talked to Rachel in almost 4 years, not since before I went to prison when we had a huge fight about money I borrowed and never paid back. I sat on the motel bed staring at my phone for 10 minutes before I finally called her number. She answered on the 3rd ring. Her voice sounded older, tired. I told her it was me, and she went completely silent for like 30 seconds. Then she started crying and asking how this was possible because she got a letter 8 months ago from the prison chaplain saying I died. The letter had official prison letterhead and everything. She said she felt terrible for not coming to the funeral, but she was broke and lived 3 states away, and our relationship had been so bad. I told her the whole story about the fake death certificate and Carter remarrying and Clayton thinking I was dead. Rachel kept saying she should have known something was wrong, that she should have called the prison to verify, but she just assumed prison officials wouldn't lie about someone dying. I asked if she still had the chaplain's letter, and she said yes. She kept it in a box with old family photos. She promised to scan it and email it to me right away. Then I asked the hard part, if she would give a DNA sample to prove we were sisters and maybe testify in court about our family history. Rachel agreed immediately. She said she wanted to help fix this mess, and she was sorry for not being there when I needed her. We talked for almost an hour, catching up on everything that happened in the years we didn't speak. She told me about her kids getting bigger, and her divorce, and her new job at a grocery store. It felt good to have family on my side again, even family I'd been mad at for years. After we hung up, Rachel's email came through with a scan of the chaplain's letter. It looked just as official as all the other fake documents, with the prison logo and a signature from someone named Chaplain Zion. I forwarded it to Halima right away. 3 days later, Halima called to say she'd arranged everything with a state lab for DNA testing. The appointment was set for the next morning at 9 a.m. Carter agreed to bring Clayton, and Rachel was driving in from out of state to give her sample too. That night I barely slept, thinking about seeing Clayton again in that clinical setting. The lab was in a medical building downtown, all white walls and fluorescent lights that made everything look cold and harsh. I got there early and sat in the waiting room until Carter arrived with Clayton. My son looked so small walking through those glass doors, holding his dad's hand. He was wearing his favorite blue shirt with dinosaurs on it, the one I bought him for his 7th birthday. When Clayton saw me sitting there, he stopped walking and just stared. I smiled at him but didn't say anything because Halima warned me the court's temporary order meant no contact during the appointment. The lab tech called us back to a room with 3 chairs and a metal table covered in supplies. She explained the process to Clayton in a nice voice, telling him it would just be a quick swab inside his cheek and it wouldn't hurt at all. Clayton kept looking at me while she talked, like he was trying to figure something out. Carter stood behind him with his hands on Clayton's shoulders, protective. The tech did my sample first, rubbing the swab along the inside of my cheek for 30 seconds. Then she did Clayton's sample while he sat very still and brave. I watched my son's face the whole time, memorizing every detail because I didn't know when I'd see him again. His eyes were exactly like mine, dark brown with little gold flecks. He had a small scar on his chin from when he fell off his bike at age 5. I wanted so badly to reach out and touch him, to pull him into my arms and never let go, but I just sat there with my hands folded in my lap. After the tech finished with Clayton, she labeled all the tubes with numbers and barcodes. Carter told Clayton they could leave now, and Clayton asked in a quiet voice if he could say something to me. Carter looked uncomfortable but nodded. Clayton turned to me and said I really did smell like his mommy, and that confused him. Then Carter guided him out of the room before I could respond. I sat there for another 20 minutes waiting for Rachel to arrive. When she finally showed up, we hugged for a long time in the waiting room. She looked different, older and thinner, but her eyes were the same. The tech took Rachel's sample, and then told us the results would take 10 days with the expedited processing Halima requested. 10 days felt like forever when I knew the science would prove what I already knew, that I was Clayton's mother, and I never died in that prison cell. I spent those 10 days in the motel room mostly, watching terrible TV and trying not to go crazy with waiting. On day 6, Antonella called with new information from her investigation. She said the prison's surveillance system showed me alive and walking around my housing unit on the exact date I supposedly died. The cameras captured me in the day room, in the chow hall, in my cell. She also interviewed other women from my unit, and they all confirmed I was there that whole week, very much alive. Multiple people remembered seeing me and talking to me on the day the death certificate said I killed myself. Antonella's voice got more serious when she told me the next part. She found another inmate death that happened 3 days before my supposed death. A woman named Jazz who died of a heart attack or something medical. Jazz had no family, so her body was released to the county for burial in the prison cemetery, where inmates with nobody go. But here's the disturbing part. The timing of Jazz's death and my fake death lined up too perfectly to be a coincidence. Antonella thought someone might have switched our identities in the prison records, declaring me dead and having Jazz's body buried under my name. I felt sick hearing this, thinking about some poor woman buried in a grave with my name on the headstone. Antonella explained her theory about why this happened. If Reina and Rodrigo were stealing mail like I suspected, and if my grievance 8 months ago could have exposed them, they might have seen Jazz's death as an opportunity. By declaring me dead in the system, they could make any complaints I filed disappear as clerical errors. With me officially deceased, Carter would stop asking questions about missing letters. I'd be trapped in this bureaucratic nightmare even after my release date. The whole theory made horrible sense in a way that made me want to throw up. They declared me dead and buried someone else under my name just to cover up stealing mail and whatever other shady stuff they were doing. Carter would stop calling the prison asking why his wife wasn't writing back. Any grievances I filed would get dismissed because dead inmates don't file complaints. I asked Antonella what would happen to Reina and Rodrigo if she proved this theory true. She said they could face federal charges for falsifying government documents, mail fraud, and civil rights violations. The prison administration could also face huge liability for failing to catch such a massive error in their system. Federal investigators might get involved. People could lose their jobs. There might be lawsuits. Antonella told me she was building a strong case but needed more evidence before bringing charges. She was tracking down the transport records for Jazz's body and interviewing more staff members who worked in the mailroom. Everything was moving forward, she said, but these investigations take time. I thanked her and hung up, feeling angry and validated at the same time. Angry that people would destroy my life just to hide their crimes. Validated that someone in authority finally believed my story and was working to prove it. 5 days before the court hearing, Halima called my motel room at 8 in the morning. The DNA results were back from the state lab. She read the numbers to me over the phone. 99.97% probability that I was Clayton's biological mother. My sister's DNA confirmed we were siblings. The lab had no doubt about my identity. Halima said she was filing the results with the court within the hour and sending copies to Carter's lawyer and the state attorney. I sat on the motel bed after hanging up, staring at the printed email confirmation she sent to the business center downstairs. Science proved what I already knew. but seeing those numbers made it real in a way that felt different. My phone rang again 2 hours later. Carter's name showed on the screen. I answered and heard him crying before he said anything. He kept apologizing, saying he didn't know how to process that he buried someone else while I was still alive. His voice broke when he asked if we could meet again to talk about telling Clayton the truth. I said yes immediately. We agreed to meet at the same coffee shop the next morning. I spent the rest of the day pacing the motel room, thinking about seeing Carter again now that he finally believed me completely. The next morning I got to the coffee shop early and sat in the same booth we used before. Carter arrived 10 minutes later carrying a manila envelope. He looked like he hadn't slept much. He sat down across from me and slid the envelope over. Inside were printed photos from Clayton's 8th birthday party that happened 3 months ago. A birthday I missed because everyone thought I was dead. I looked through the pictures one by one. Clayton wearing a superhero cape, blowing out candles on a Batman cake, opening presents in our living room that now belonged to Cassandra too. Seeing my son's face in those moments, I should have been part of, made me want to scream. Carter watched me look at the photos and started talking. He explained that Cassandra was struggling hard with the reality that I was alive. She built a whole family with him believing I was gone forever. Now she was 7 months pregnant and scared about what my return meant for her marriage and her baby's future. I understood why she felt that way, but it didn't change anything about what I needed. I told Carter I didn't want to destroy his new family, but I also wouldn't be erased from Clayton's life anymore. We needed to figure out a way for everyone to exist together, even if it was messy and uncomfortable, because Clayton deserved to know his real mother. Carter nodded and suggested we start with supervised visitation once the court officially restored my identity. That would give Clayton time to adjust slowly instead of overwhelming him all at once. It wasn't what I wanted. I wanted to hold my son and never let go. But I agreed because pushing too hard too fast could hurt Clayton more. The court hearing arrived on a Tuesday morning. Halima met me outside the courthouse at 9. We went through security and waited in a hallway until they called our case. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. The judge sat behind a tall wooden desk. A state attorney sat at one table. Halima and I sat at another. My sister flew in and sat in the gallery behind us. Halima stood and presented our evidence piece by piece. The DNA results showing 99.97% certainty I was Clayton's mother. Prison surveillance footage showing me alive and moving around on the date I supposedly died. The funeral home file that Mick provided showing the sealed body transport and irregular identification process. Antonella's investigation findings about Reina and the suspicious timing of everything. My sister's testimony about our family history and the fake letter she received about my death. The state attorney stood up when Halima finished. He said the state didn't contest the facts and agreed that my identity should be restored immediately. The judge looked at all the paperwork spread across her desk. She asked me to stand and state my name for the record. I said my name out loud in that courtroom. Vivian Jennings. The judge issued her order right there. She declared that I was alive. The death certificate was issued in error. All state agencies must correct their records immediately. She also granted a temporary visitation order allowing supervised contact with Clayton, while a full custody evaluation got scheduled. Walking out of the courthouse with legal proof that I existed felt strange after weeks of being treated like a ghost. Halima hugged me on the steps outside. She said this was just the beginning. We still had to pursue accountability for what happened and figure out permanent custody arrangements. But at least now I was officially alive again, and Clayton's legal mother in the eyes of the law. That's everything I had for you today. I always try to make sure you leave with something useful, not just a story. If it gave you an idea or a little clarity, then it did its job. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one.